It was the winter of 1940. Europe was falling into shadow. France had surrendered, Norway was occupied, and Britain stood alone. But as German troops patrolled from the Pyrenees to the Channel, hundreds of stranded Allied airmen, diplomats, and agents remained trapped behind enemy lines. For the men of MI6, the question was immediate and desperate: how to bring them home? The answer would lie in one of the most unlikely sanctuaries in Europe, neutral Switzerland. From the outside, Switzerland was a fortress of neutrality, ringed by the Alps, untouched by bombing raids, and ruled by strict military discipline. But beneath its calm surface, a quiet war unfolded. In the capital city of Bern, inside a discreet white building on Thunstrasse 50, the British legation served as the headquarters of Sir David Kelly, Britain's minister to Switzerland. Officially, it was a diplomatic office. In reality, it was a covert command post for British intelligence, the nerve center of MI6 operations in Central Europe. The man who would shape the shadow network was Claude Danzy, deputy chief of MI6, known within intelligence circles as Colonel Z. Danzy had long believed that traditional military operations could not win the secret war in Europe. Espionage, deception, and quiet escape routes, these, he argued, were Britain's invisible weapons. When reports reached London that Allied agents and pilots were being captured in occupied France and Belgium, Danzy authorized the creation of what would later be called the Swiss Escape Line. Its purpose was simple but deadly in execution: extract trapped personnel and smuggle them through occupied France into Switzerland, then onward to Britain via neutral Portugal or Spain. Switzerland's geographical position, bordered by Germany, Austria, France, and Italy, made it both a sanctuary and a trap. For every mountain pass that offered a path to freedom, there was another guarded by German patrols or Swiss border police loyal to neutrality laws that forbade aiding belligerents. The network's first operatives were diplomats, couriers, and Swiss sympathizers, men and women who moved unnoticed across borders. In Lausanne, a young attaché named Victor Farrell coordinated communication between MI6 and field operatives in France. Couriers carried messages written on silk and concealed inside hollowed-out fountain pens. At the same time, coded radio transmissions between Bern and London were sent under the cover of weather reports. In late 1940, the first successful extraction took place near Geneva. 2 Royal Air Force pilots, shot down during a bombing raid over northern France, were hidden in a freight train carrying grain shipments into Switzerland. The train was inspected by German customs agents, but the Swiss guards, quietly sympathetic, allowed it through. When the pilots arrived at the British legation in Bern, they brought with them intelligence about Luftwaffe operations in northern France, the kind of detail MI6 could not obtain through ordinary channels. But the operation's success carried risk. Switzerland's federal police, wary of any action that could compromise neutrality, began tracking movements around the British legation. German intelligence, too, took notice. The Gestapo station in Paris intercepted a coded letter referring to the mountain couriers, a phrase that would haunt MI6 for the rest of the war. Inside the legation, the tension was palpable. Each visitor, each phone call, might conceal betrayal. In a letter to London, one British diplomat wrote, "We stand on a line as thin as the frontier itself. One step too far, and we fall into either side's grasp." Still, the operation grew. Agents from the Special Operations Executive, SOE, began feeding information into the Swiss network, linking it to resistance cells in Lyon and Besançon. By early 1941, Bern had become a hub of espionage, where every embassy and consulate seemed to play a double game. American, German, Italian, and Soviet operatives crowded the same cafes, each shadowing the others. Within this labyrinth, MI6's escape network hid in plain sight, behind diplomatic cables, coded telegrams, and harmless-seeming social events. As the war dragged on, word of the Swiss lines spread among Allied pilots. To them, Switzerland became a whispered word of hope. Yet, for every successful crossing, there were failures. Men caught by German patrols in the Jura Mountains, or turned back by Swiss border guards under orders to maintain strict neutrality. Some disappeared entirely, last seen walking through the snow, guided by strangers who may or may not have been what they claimed. For MI6, each disappearance deepened the mystery. Who was betraying the routes? Was it Swiss officials? German double agents? Or someone inside the legation itself? The answers remained elusive. But one thing was certain: the network had proven its worth. It was dangerous, fragile, and necessary. As Claude Danzy wrote in a classified memo to the War Office in December 1940, Switzerland will serve as the eye of the storm, neutral in name, but vital to the survival of our men. The storm, however, was only beginning to gather. Within a year, the escape line would grow into a continental operation stretching from Paris to Lisbon, coordinated through secret codes and alpine trails. And with that growth came new enemies and the first whispers of infiltration. The stage was set for Operation Marathon, MI6's most daring and most perilous mission yet. In early 1941, the British intelligence service began what it called Operation Marathon, a plan so delicate it could collapse under a single misplaced word. Conceived by MI6's Claude Danzy and executed from Bern, the operation aimed to connect the chaos of occupied France with the fragile safety of Switzerland. At its heart lay one purpose: to guide stranded Allied agents, airmen, and couriers across German lines through a neutral state already teetering under pressure from both Berlin and London. The operation's staging ground stretched across the Jura Mountains, a rugged frontier where thick forests and limestone ridges hid narrow smuggling trails. To traverse this landscape, MI6 relied on men and women who knew the terrain intimately. Among them was Jules Deveau, a French railway worker turned guide, and a Swiss officer named Captain Max Weibel, who quietly aided British intelligence despite the risk of court-martial. Their cooperation symbolized the delicate dance of wartime Switzerland, a neutral country that served both as a sanctuary and a silent accomplice. Every mission began in the French resistance cells around Besançon or Lyon. There, British-trained agents from the Special Operations Executive, SOE, coordinated with local operatives who forged identity papers and ration cards. Using invisible ink and coded postcards, they informed the British legation in Bern when a group was ready to cross. The journey from Lyon to the Swiss border could take days, often by night train or by foot through forests crawling with German patrols. For MI6, the route had to remain invisible. The German Abwehr, the military intelligence service, had begun to suspect that captured Allied airmen were disappearing in the region. In March 1941, the Gestapo stationed additional patrols in Pontarlier and Neuchâtel, tightening the noose around the Jura frontier. One careless move could expose the entire network. Yet Danzy's men persisted. In one report dated April 1941, a courier known only as Agent Yvonne described a crossing through Les Verrières, a remote mountain pass on the Franco-Swiss border. Snow covered the trails, she wrote in her post-mission debrief. We could see the German patrol fires below us. We moved without light. The last mile we crawled. When we reached the first Swiss sentry, he whispered only one word: Bienvenue. Such acts of quiet defiance defined Operation Marathon. Officially, Switzerland maintained neutrality under international law. Unofficially, dozens of Swiss border guards looked the other way when faced with British escapees, guided by a sense of moral duty that contradicted their orders. Others, however, were less sympathetic. In June 1941, a Swiss customs officer in St. Croix arrested 3 men carrying British identification forged in Lyon. They were turned over to German authorities, and their names vanished from all records, a reminder that neutrality could be as dangerous as occupation itself. Inside the Bern legation, communication was a constant balancing act. Cables sent to London were disguised as trade reports or weather summaries, each line containing layers of coded meaning. When London received the phrase "heavy fog across Jura," it signaled that a crossing was in progress. If the message read "clear skies," the mission had failed. But for all its ingenuity, Operation Marathon faced an invisible threat: betrayal. In the summer of 1941, MI6 intercepted evidence that German counterintelligence had infiltrated several escape lines in France. Interrogations of captured agents hinted that someone within the neutral zone was feeding information to Berlin. Danzy responded by dividing the network into small, isolated cells. No operative knew more than one route, one contact, or one password. This fragmentation saved lives, but it also sowed confusion and fear. The network's risks extended beyond espionage. The very existence of such operations placed immense diplomatic strain on Britain's relationship with Switzerland. The Swiss government, led by Federal Councillor Marcel Pilot-Golas, had already issued stern warnings against foreign intelligence activity on its soil. To be caught aiding MI6 men imprisonment or deportation. Still, the network endured, protected, in part, by the secrecy of its methods and the plausible deniability of diplomatic immunity. By late 1941, Operation Marathon had moved more than 40 individuals, a mixture of downed airmen, couriers, and intelligence officers, into Swiss territory. Some continued to Lisbon via Spain. Others remained in internment camps, their presence quietly acknowledged by sympathetic Swiss officials. The operation's early success convinced London to expand its scope, establishing coordination between MI6, WWII, and the Polish and Czech intelligence networks operating in exile. And yet, the cracks were already showing. Reports of missing couriers began to reach Bern. Letters from the field stopped arriving. A coded radio transmission from the Lyon sector ended abruptly in static. "We have lost contact with," the message read, before cutting off entirely. The silence that followed was unnerving, and it would not be the last. As winter approached again, Danzig faced a grim realization. For every man or woman successfully smuggled through Switzerland, another vanished without a trace. The routes that had once seemed safe were now under watch. Somewhere along the mountain corridors, someone was listening, someone who knew the trails, the code phrases, and the timing of every crossing. In the coming months, MI6 would bring in a new operative to investigate the disappearances, a woman whose name would later become synonymous with loyalty, courage, and unanswered questions, Vera Atkins. And with her arrival, the secret escape network through Switzerland would enter its most perilous phase. By the spring of 1942, the war had reached a turning point. German forces were pushing deep into the Soviet Union, and Allied bombers were striking targets across occupied Europe. But behind the front lines, in the silent corridors of neutral Switzerland, a different battle was being fought, one of deception, loyalty, and betrayal. And at its center stood a woman whose calm precision masked an iron will, Vera Atkins. Atkins, born in Romania to a Jewish family, had joined Britain's Special Operations Executive, WWII, at the outbreak of the war. She served under Colonel Maurice Buckmaster in F Section, responsible for coordinating agents in occupied France. Her task was as critical as it was perilous, maintaining communication between London and the men and women risking their lives in the field. When reports began reaching MI6 of missing couriers and disrupted escape lines in eastern France, Atkins volunteered to investigate. Her journey would bring her face-to-face with the inner workings of MI6's Swiss network, and with mysteries that would haunt her long after the war ended. She arrived in Bern in May 1942 under the guise of an embassy secretary. Her presence was officially clerical, but in truth, she carried with her coded directives from London, maps of compromised routes, and a list of missing agents last seen near the Swiss frontier. Her contact in Bern was Victor Farrell, a British attaché already managing communication between the WWII's field agents and MI6's logistical teams. Together, they began tracing the vanished couriers. Atkins quickly discovered a pattern. Several of the missing agents, all using separate routes through Jura and the Savoy, had sent identical final messages. Crossing complete at dawn. After that, nothing. No further transmissions, no verified arrivals in Switzerland. When Atkins compared the data, she realized the last confirmed sighting for each agent occurred within 20 kilometers of Neuchâtel, an area patrolled by both German border troops and Swiss customs guards. It was as if the agents had walked into the snow and simply disappeared. Her investigation led her to the small town of Fleurier, near the French border, where local villagers had reported nighttime movements along the old smuggler's trail. In a debrief preserved in Eclipse Archives, Atkins described what she found. The trail ended in a ravine, and at its base, scraps of British uniform cloth frozen into the ice. The local guard claimed ignorance. I did not believe him. Back in Bern, Atkins met with Claude Danzy's liaison officer, codenamed Hector. He warned her to tread carefully. The Gestapo's intelligence chief in occupied France, SS Sturmbannführer Hugo Bleicher, had begun targeting escape networks, posing as a sympathetic intermediary. Rumors spread that Bleicher's agents had infiltrated the Swiss line, passing information through double agents disguised as neutral businessmen. The deeper Atkins looked, the more the lines between ally and enemy blurred. To maintain secrecy, she turned to one of MI6's most ingenious tools, the microdot. Messages no larger than a pinhead were hidden inside postage stamps, invisible to the naked eye. Atkins used these to communicate with London, encoding updates within harmless correspondence. Parcel received, conditions satisfactory, she wrote. Code for contact confirmed, route compromised. But even as her reports reached Britain, the disappearances continued. The stress of the work was relentless. In a letter found decades later in the National Archives, she confided to a colleague, "I fear we are losing more than men. We are losing the truth of how and why they vanish." The network's enemies were closing in. German counterintelligence, operating out of Dijon, had begun tracing radio transmissions linked to Swiss agents. At the same time, the Swiss Federal Police intensified surveillance around Bern's diplomatic quarter, searching for signs of illegal espionage activity. Atkins and Farrell now had to work under the eyes of both friends and foes. Despite the danger, her persistence paid off. Through a coded message smuggled via a Red Cross courier, Atkins learned that one of the missing agents, a courier known only as Paul, had been captured near Pontarlier by German patrols, then quietly transferred into Swiss custody under diplomatic secrecy. The discovery shocked her. It suggested that elements within Switzerland were cooperating with German intelligence to maintain neutrality at any cost. In the words of one MI6 memorandum, Swiss cooperation, though declared impartial, increasingly favors survival over principle. Still, Atkins refused to abandon the mission. With Farrell's help, she mapped new crossing points farther south, near Geneva and on sea, where resistance groups maintained closer ties with the Allies. She re-established contact with several field agents, among them Lieutenant Robert Benoist, a former Grand Prix driver turned saboteur, who praised her precision and resolve. Yet even Benoist would later vanish, captured and executed at Buchenwald in 1944. By late 1942, Operation Marathon was under severe strain. The Germans had infiltrated parts of the SWI's French circuits, compromising safe houses and couriers. The Swiss route remained functional but fragile, dependent on a shrinking number of loyal guides and sympathetic officials. Inside the British legation, the atmosphere turned cold and suspicious. Who could be trusted? Was the leak within their ranks? Or was it simply the result of luck running out? When Atkins returned to London in the autumn of 1942, she brought with her lists of names. Agents confirmed dead, others presumed missing, and several who might still be alive somewhere in Switzerland. The files were incomplete, some marked status unknown. She handed them to Buckmaster with a simple statement. "There are ghosts along the border. We must find out who killed them." It was a question that would linger long after her return, one that MI6 could neither confirm nor deny. And as the network pressed on into 1943, the line between rescue and sacrifice would become thinner than ever. By the winter of 1943, the Swiss frontier was no longer a refuge. It was a battlefield without gunfire. Beneath the snow-covered peaks and quiet border villages, a silent struggle unfolded between MI6's escape network and the tightening web of German counterintelligence. The Gestapo had turned its gaze towards Switzerland, determined to crush the underground routes that carried Allied airmen and agents to safety. And for those within the British legation in Bern, the noose was beginning to close. The turning point came after a series of intercepted radio transmissions in December 1942. German signals analysts at Dijon traced encrypted messages sent from the Jura region to British-controlled channels in Bern. The Gestapo, led by SS officer Hugo Bleicher, concluded that the Swiss route was more extensive than anyone had imagined. Within weeks, Berlin authorized Operation Edelweiss, a counter-espionage campaign to identify and dismantle all escape lines running through neutral territory. In early 1943, German patrols were reinforced along the border between France and Switzerland, particularly near Geneva and Basel. Meanwhile, the Swiss Federal Police, pressured by both Berlin and their own government, began conducting neutrality enforcement operations, investigations into suspected espionage within Swiss territory. For MI6, this meant every movement, every coded message, and every false passport carried new peril. Even the protection of diplomatic immunity began to crumble. Inside the British legation, the strain was visible. Victor Farrell, the attaché who had overseen communications with the French resistance, wrote in his coded diary, "Our sanctuary is no longer sacred. The walls have ears and perhaps eyes." He wasn't wrong. In February 1943, Swiss authorities arrested a courier carrying funds and forged documents linked to the Bern network. When questioned, the courier claimed to be working on behalf of the Red Cross, a cover MI6 had used for months. The Swiss investigators, uncomfortable but compelled by law, informed their German counterparts in Bern. The message was clear: the neutral ground was vanishing. At the same time, reports from the field painted an increasingly desperate picture. In the Jura Mountains, local guides began refusing assignments, fearing exposure. The once reliable route through Les Verrières was compromised when a Gestapo unit set up permanent observation posts disguised as customs inspectors. Couriers who had used that trail for years suddenly disappeared. Some were later found dead in the snow, their documents missing, their bodies stripped of identification. MI6's communications grew cryptic and cautious. Messages to London referenced heavy snowstorms, closed passes, or broken compasses, euphemisms for arrests, betrayals, or lost agents. London urged restraint, but in Bern, the calculus was different. For every agent captured, another had to replace them, or the entire network risked collapsing. "If the flow stops," Farrell wrote, "so does hope." Meanwhile, the Gestapo's intelligence network expanded into the Swiss cities themselves. Agents posing as German businessmen began frequenting cafes in Lausanne and Neuchâtel, listening for foreign accents and following suspected couriers. The Swiss, ever vigilant about maintaining neutrality, turned a blind eye until the pressure from Berlin grew too intense. In April 1943, the Federal Council authorized the detention of several foreign nationals engaged in unapproved intelligence activity. Among those arrested was a Swiss telegraph operator who had passed coded messages from Bern to Lyon. He vanished into military custody, never to be seen again. For Vera Atkins, now back in London but still overseeing SOE field reports, the news was devastating. Her files filled with reports stamped, "Missing, presumed dead." Agents she had trained and dispatched, men and women she knew by name, were vanishing faster than ever. In a letter to Buckmaster, she wrote, "We are losing them one by one, as though the frontier itself has swallowed them." Back in Switzerland, MI6 found an unexpected ally. Swiss Army officer Major Max Weibel, already known for his subtle sympathy toward the Allies. From his post in Lucerne, Weibel provided quiet assistance, arranging for forged identity papers, manipulating border patrol rosters, and coordinating safe passage for select individuals under humanitarian pretext. His actions would later become legendary, but at the time, they were acts of calculated defiance that could have cost him his life. Still, even Weibel's efforts could not reverse the tide. The Gestapo's infiltration methods were becoming sophisticated. Agents disguised as refugees began presenting themselves at Swiss refugee offices, hoping to gain entry and identify British contacts. In July 1943, a man claiming to be a downed RAF pilot was accepted by the network, only to later be revealed as an Abwehr operative. His false story led to the arrest of 4 real escapees, their bodies discovered months later in the Rhone Valley. The revelation shook Bern to its core. As summer turned to autumn, the mood inside the British legation grew heavy. Every file cabinet, Every coded message seemed to carry the weight of suspicion. Claude Danzy, operating from London, sent strict orders. All records of the Swiss network were to be reduced to microfilm or destroyed outright. "No trace must remain if we fall," he wrote. "Switzerland must stay clean." By late 1943, the Swiss authorities, under intense German scrutiny, raided several suspected safe houses in Lausanne and Zurich. Though no direct link to MI6 was proven, the arrests forced the British to suspend most cross-border operations. For the first time since its creation, the escape line went dark. But not entirely. A few agents, working without sanction, guided by conscience rather than command, continued the crossings in secret, using false Red Cross credentials and supply trucks as cover. These were not official missions, but acts of survival. Their names were never recorded. Some made it through. Others vanished. And then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the Gestapo's focus shifted eastward with the Allied invasion of Italy. The Swiss network, bloodied but unbroken, lay dormant, waiting for the next call from London. Yet within the walls of the British legation, the silence was uneasy. Too many names were missing, too many questions unanswered. Who had betrayed the routes? And how much had the Swiss government really known? The next phase of the operation would bring answers, and a revelation that changed everything. By early 1944, Europe was trembling on the edge of liberation, yet for MI6 in Switzerland, the war had become more dangerous than ever. The Gestapo's shadow still lingered along the frontiers, and inside the British legation in Bern, the mood had shifted from cautious optimism to desperate resolve. The mission's purpose had evolved, no longer just to rescue stranded airmen or agents, but to preserve the network itself and the intelligence it had gathered at immense cost. It was in this climate of secrecy and fear that Operation Marathon reached its peak. Using a complex web of safe houses, sympathetic Swiss officers, and forged humanitarian credentials, MI6 and the Special Operations Executive, SOE, continued extracting Allied personnel from occupied France. Every successful crossing carried not just lives, but information, enemy troop movements, Luftwaffe unit deployments, even intelligence from disillusioned German officers seeking asylum. The key to the operation's renewed success was deception. Couriers now carried Red Cross credentials, allowing them to move under the guise of medical workers. Trucks marked with Geneva emblems transported both supplies and passengers, often driving perilously close to German checkpoints. One Swiss customs officer, later interviewed after the war, recalled, "They came at night, always polite, always efficient. We knew what they were doing. We simply chose not to see." Among the masterminds of this deception was Major Max Weibel of the Swiss Army, the same officer who had quietly aided British intelligence for years. Weibel's influence within the Swiss military allowed him to manipulate records, adjust patrol schedules, and facilitate crossings that otherwise would have been impossible. He coordinated directly with Alan Dulles, head of the American OSS, Office of Strategic Services, in Bern, whose villa at Herrengasse 23 became the informal meeting point for British, American, and Swiss operatives. Together, they ran overlapping escape channels that blurred the lines between neutrality and conspiracy. In May 1944, one of the most daring missions of the war took place. A group of 6 downed RAF airmen were smuggled out of occupied France, across Lake Geneva, and into Switzerland aboard a disguised Red Cross supply barge. German patrols searched the lake daily, but the operation succeeded without a trace. The airmen, once safe in Bern, provided detailed maps of Luftwaffe radar installations near Dijon, intelligence that would later aid Allied bombing operations during the Normandy campaign. Not all missions went so smoothly. In July 1944, a courier team attempting to cross near Montreux was betrayed by an informant. The Germans ambushed them before they reached the border, killing 2 and capturing 3. One survivor, interviewed after the war, recalled, "They knew our names, our passwords, even our route. Someone on the inside had sold us out." The betrayal reinforced MI6's growing suspicion that their enemies were not only in Berlin, but within the very system that claimed neutrality. Inside the British legation, Pressure from London intensified. MI6 headquarters demanded results but forbade any action that might endanger diplomatic relations with Bern. It was a paradox Danzig had anticipated. Switzerland was both an ally and a liability. To operate there meant to trust a government walking a diplomatic tightrope between survival and betrayal. Still, the network pressed on, its agents driven by duty and instinct rather than orders. By late summer, as Allied forces advanced through France, the Swiss escape lines became conduits for something more valuable than men: information. German officers seeking asylum began approaching British and American contacts in Bern. Among them was Colonel Walter Schellenberg, a high-ranking SS officer known to have connections within the Gestapo's intelligence division. Through secret meetings arranged by Weibel and Dulles, MI6 extracted intelligence on the crumbling state of the Reich's military command. These contacts would later prove crucial in the closing months of the war, when negotiations for German surrender in Italy began. Throughout this period, Vera Atkins, still coordinating SWI records from London, pushed to identify and retrieve the missing agents from the Swiss frontier. Her efforts were largely stonewalled by both British and Swiss officials, the latter refusing to disclose details that might implicate their own neutrality. Our friends in Bern, one MI6 memorandum read coldly, are selective in their memory. Many of the agents Atkins had once supervised were now either presumed dead or listed as unaccounted for. The files remained open and unanswered. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the network's final mission came not from London, but from necessity. Rumors circulated that key German officers in northern Italy were seeking to surrender to the Allies through Switzerland. Weibel and Dulles, with quiet approval from MI6, initiated Operation Sunrise, a series of secret contacts between the OSS and SS General Karl Wolff. The meetings took place in the remote Engadine Valley, under the watch of Swiss intermediaries. Through these covert channels, an early surrender in Italy was arranged, one that would save countless lives and shorten the war on the Southern Front. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Swiss network dissolved almost overnight. Its records were fragmented, its operatives scattered. In Bern, MI6 officials began burning correspondence, destroying ciphers, and erasing traces of their presence. What remained were whispers and fragments, names crossed out in ledgers, maps with trails ending abruptly, and a few coded letters that survived only by accident. One of those letters, written by a British field officer, ended with a haunting line: "We are ghosts of a war fought in silence, in a land that pretended to hear nothing." Yet, even as Switzerland returned to peace, questions lingered. How much had its government known about the British and American operations within its borders? How deeply had neutrality been compromised? And what happened to those who disappeared during the crossings? The answers, hidden in classified archives and forgotten mountainside graves, would begin to surface only years later, revealing the final, uneasy truth behind MI6's secret escape network. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was almost louder than the conflict itself. In the spring of 1945, as Europe celebrated victory, MI6 operatives in Switzerland quietly packed their files into crates and burned what they couldn't carry. The official story was simple. The British legation in Bern had provided diplomatic support during the war. But the truth, the existence of a secret escape network that had smuggled agents, soldiers, and intelligence through neutral territory, was buried beneath layers of denial and secrecy. For months, Allied investigators sifted through what little remained. Records had been reduced to cinders. Codenames replaced real identities. Financial transactions were disguised as cultural grants or medical aid. What emerged was only a silhouette of the truth, a network that had operated under Swiss neutrality, yet depended on silent cooperation from within it. One surviving MI6 document, recovered from the British National Archives decades later, summarized the paradox. The Swiss escape system functioned on trust among men who could never admit to trusting one another. It was an operation so delicate that, even in peace, it could not be acknowledged. Any admission of Swiss complicity would have undermined the nation's carefully maintained image of impartiality, and risked diplomatic fallout with post-war Europe. Meanwhile, the survivors of the network tried to rebuild their lives in the shadows of their own secrecy. Major Max Weibel returned to the Swiss Army, his wartime activities officially unrecognized until years later, when the truth of his role in Operation Sunrise surfaced. His quiet defiance had helped shorten the war in Italy, yet to the public, he remained a loyal servant of Swiss neutrality. Allen Dulles, the American OSS chief in Bern, went on to lead the newly formed CIA, a testament to how the neutral corridors of Switzerland had become the birthplace of post-war intelligence cooperation. For MI6, the reckoning came slower. Vera Atkins, haunted by the fates of her missing agents, spent years after the war tracking down their stories. She visited prisons, archives, and battlefields across Europe, determined to find answers. In 1947, she traveled to Germany to testify at the Nuremberg trials, where she confronted surviving Gestapo officers who had hunted her operatives. Some spoke openly of captured agents handed over through neutral channels. Atkins recognized the term, a reference, she suspected, to Swiss intermediaries who had maintained the facade of neutrality while appeasing German demands. The revelation left her shaken. Neutrality, she later wrote in her private notes, is a shield that cuts both ways. Even within Britain, the story was treated with caution. MI6 refused to publicly acknowledge the Swiss network or its participants. The Foreign Office classified all documentation related to Operation Marathon and its successor programs, citing diplomatic sensitivities. Historians who later examined fragments of the files found entire sections redacted, names blacked out, and entire years missing. What little remained confirmed only that hundreds of men and women had crossed through Switzerland during the war, and that not all had made it out alive. The mystery of those who disappeared remained unsolved. Mountain villagers in Neuchâtel and the Jura continued to tell stories of strangers passing through at night, some never seen again. In 1968, hikers discovered human remains near the old Les Verrières Pass, along with fragments of a RAF uniform. Swiss authorities quietly handed the evidence to the British Embassy. No statement, no publicity, no closure. The file was marked repatriated, unidentified. Over time, the truth became a patchwork of speculation and partial confessions. Former Swiss officials admitted to having overlooked British activities in the interest of humanitarian duty. Declassified OSS memos revealed that Bern had been the epicenter of Allied intelligence in Central Europe, a neutral city serving as a crossroads for espionage, diplomacy, and secret deals. It was in those same rooms that peace negotiations, escape operations, and intelligence trades had coexisted under the same flag of neutrality. For historians, the network's legacy raised enduring questions. How many lives did MI6's Swiss route actually save? How deeply were Swiss officials involved, willingly or otherwise? And how many of the agents who vanished were victims of betrayal, caught between conflicting loyalties? Even today, much of the truth remains locked away. Key files on wartime intelligence operations through Switzerland are still restricted under British secrecy laws, their contents too politically sensitive to disclose. The Swiss Archives, too, hold sealed collections marked wartime neutrality, restricted until 2045. The silence, it seems, continues to serve both sides. Yet the story refuses to fade. Each rediscovered memo, each survivor's diary, reveals fragments of a clandestine war fought not with bullets, but with forged papers, whispered passwords, and moral compromise. The mountains that once sheltered fugitives now hold their ghosts, silent witnesses to a struggle where right and wrong were separated by snow, fear, and a thin line of neutrality. In the end, MI6's secret escape network through Switzerland remains more than a tale of espionage. It is a study in human contradiction. It shows how courage and complicity can coexist in the same act, how a neutral nation became the silent artery of a global war, and how truth itself can be buried, not by lies, but by silence. And as the last of the wartime operatives faded into history, their legacy endured in one simple, unspoken lesson, that in the fog of war, even neutrality is never truly neutral.